welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm Ferran, and along with Kit, we seek to take our listeners on a guided tour of redemptive history, showcasing the beauty, splendor, and unity of God's amazing story of cosmic redemption and restoration and renewal. We hope that our warm conversational tone and format make an unfamiliar topic for many and intimidating for some more approachable, accessible, and digestible, growing the body in the process. This is the 59th episode in our journey through the scripture series. Over the last several weeks, we've really tried to unpack this concept, like this massive, critical, foundational concept called incarnation. And while we've tried to maybe hit it from various angles, we're really excited about the next couple of episodes because at the end of the day, what we hope it does is it's really going to take something that may seem kind of very ethereal, very high and lofty, and really bring it down to ground level too. Kit and I are going to endeavor to do that, hopefully very successfully. We really want to help people understand what is the so what. So if there's one phrase that just stick in the back of your mind is great. I have all this information. I have a deeper understanding of what incarnation is and some of the things about it. What is now the so what? And how do I now understand the practical implications of this massive critical concept? And so with that, let's go ahead and jump in, Kit, too. And I'm really excited to have this dialogue and engage today, too. From the creation account, Kit, how does Scripture present God's intent for his world to become sacred space, which we've talked about considerably over the last year and a half, through human mediation and also stewardship, which is actually a concept we haven't touched on a lot, Kit? Speak to both of those items.
Well, I think as people consider, okay, what does that have to do with incarnation? If we say that incarnation is a step in the process, the crucial step perhaps in the process of God accomplishing his purposes, then we have to go backwards and say, okay, well, what are those purposes of God? What is it that incarnation was intended to serve, to be a key factor in accomplishing? And that, as you said, takes us back to creation and back to this idea of sacred space. Once again, sacred space referring to God's connection with his creation, not just where he is on the planet or whatever, but ultimately what he intends his relationship with the creation to be. And we've seen and have emphasized over and over again that the creation account shows us that God's intent is to be present in the world and exercise his relationship with the world in and through human beings. Human beings are to be the ones who administer God's lordship and also mediate the creation's relationship back with him. So God's intent for sacred space is this intent to order and consummate his relation with his creation that has human beings at the very center. And so incarnation, maybe we haven't connected all the dots, but incarnation has to serve that goal. It has to ultimately be concerned with that end. So even when we think about the purpose of the incarnation, as well as what it is, and ultimately what God was going to accomplish through it, we have to think of it in terms of, once again, God's intent for himself in relation to his creation and his creation's relationship with him.
Kit, this idea of stewardship, we have not touched on at length a little bit. Speak a little bit more about why that is such a critical element and why we need to make sure that we not only view incarnation through that lens, but ultimately how that even ties the fulfillments of these things in terms of our purpose, our ultimate destiny. Speak a little bit more to that, because once again, like it is a newer concept that like we're introducing as well here.
Well, when we talk about stewardship, it's the idea of caring for someone else's property or someone else's interest. You know, a steward in the ancient world would have been like the householder, the person who was responsible for administering someone else's house. He wasn't the owner, he was a caretaker in that sense. And human beings are ultimately stewards in the sense that we've been discussing, that our role as human beings in God's design is to be the caretakers of his creation, of his world, to be both the point at which God administers his own rule and care and and oversight of his creation, but also to steward the creation back to God, that priestly function to mediate the creation's relationship back to God. And so ultimately, human beings are created to be the stewards of God's creation. We've talked before about Psalm 8, where, David considers the scope and the grandeur, kind of the unsearchableness of the universe as he perceived it, the sun, the moon, the stars that God has put in their place. In view of that, what is man? Man seems like nothing compared with all of that. What is man that you would care for him? And David says, you created him a little lower than God, and yet you crowned him with glory and honor. You set him over the works of your hands, to rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the animals of the land. Man, and this is Genesis again, 1 and 2, Genesis 1 particularly, man's role to be the caretaker. And so human lordship is not an autonomous thing. Sometimes even in our culture, we have a problem with human lordship, man as the Lord of the world, because it seems like, we're putting ourselves above the rest of creation. And we see what human beings do with their rule, with their lordship. We pollute, we defile, we destroy. But it's because of this thing of ruling in our own right, for our own sake, with our own agenda in mind. But we are the lords of the world, but we are vice regents. We were created to rule over God's world in his name, with his mind, with his wisdom, for his sake. And so human rule then is a stewardship function. It's a caretaking function. And ultimately, when we think about, okay, what does that have to do with incarnation? Well, if incarnation is unto that end, and we'll be sorting some of that out, then we have to ultimately see how this, the Word becoming flesh, this reality of incarnation serves this goal of how God will administer, again, his relationship with his creation, which is through human stewardship, human caretaking.
Too. And just to add it to the additional titles that we've already ascribed to us, Kit, too, we've talked about the idea of son, right? Of witness,
Right.
of disciple, all these. Just so we're clear, what we're essentially saying is we can also add stewardship to that list as well, and that it actually has two prongs. It is relational in terms of how you've impacted and tied it all the way back to the creation and our ultimate destiny. And it also is a functional role as well through
Right.
us and this vice regent capacity to fulfill God's design and intent through us as well, too. So, Kit, building on that too, how does the incarnation in Jesus, the singular image son, reveal the fulfillment of this intent, showing God fully present and active within his creation and summing all things up in him?
Well, there's a lot in that, but I think, again, we have to kind of back up or start at the most basic level and say, what do most people think about this idea of incarnation? And I think, outside of Christian circles, and even some Christians don't really agree that that's even true or that is even possible. How can you? It's like trying to put oil and water together. Deity and humanity are two different realities of being. How can you stick them together? You can't have a God-man in that sense. And so there are a lot of people who just view this idea of incarnation as impossible. I think in Christian circles, the tendency is to think of the incarnation as simply God's way of providing a sinless substitute for sinners. In other words, we need a man who can die for other men, but a man who doesn't have his own sin. And the tendency there then is to define this incarnate son, to define Jesus as a different kind of human being. He's the God-man. He's not like us. He's a different sort of human being. And that tends to have us miss the fact, as we've discussed, that Jesus is truly, fully a son of Adam, just as we are. Hebrews talks a lot about that idea, and so we can't make Jesus be a different sort of human being than we are. We have to see him as taking up our humanness, our Adamic humanness, in order to heal it, in order to create in himself a renewed and a true human race for the sake of this human vocation, this human role that we've been talking about. So that's, again, why we have to kind of hold all of the pieces together and, not just think in theological categories or attribute categories, but to ultimately think in terms of how the scripture presents these things, and ultimately, again, what God is accomplishing through this work of incarnation. And there is a mystery to it, but yet it has to be viewed, I think, in that sort of way. So that's kind of the starting point. And I don't know if that really touches on what you're trying to get at, but
Yeah. But Ken, I got to be honest too, and I can tell the record skip for a lot of people when you said we can't think of Jesus as being a different human than we are. I think a lot of people might have logged off. And then so we're going to have to go back to that a little bit too, because not that you glossed over it, Kit, too, but I think people's tension, our Kit, is if we're honest, we do see Jesus as being this superhero of sorts, right? In other words, we do
Right.
not, right? Even though these things are unpacked in Philippians and elsewhere too, is we don't equate his humanity being equal with our own, right? Not better, not superior in that. Kit, maybe take another stab or maybe restate that another way too, because I think that is the ultimate tension, in particular with the incarnation, where even if people want to believe that and get their head around it in terms of intellectually, I think right now they're getting stuck there too, because if we're honest, they do not live as such, they do not speak as such in terms of Jesus's true, authentic humanity. Speak to that a little bit more, Kit.
Well, I think there are a couple ways in which we see that that's how people think. One of them is that when people hear a statement like that, when we say Jesus, the incarnation is God taking up our fallen Adamic humanness, people hear, oh, Jesus was a sinner. You're saying he was a sinner. He was sinful. Well, that's heresy. That's not Christian truth. And then, as you say, there's just kind of a shutting down or preparing to tar and feather, because that's just, we can't have that. That just destroys the whole
right?
idea.
It's blasphemy, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So, and the other thing, I've had people say to me, the reason that Jesus' blood was atoning is that it was divine blood. It wasn't human blood. There's an efficacy or an effectiveness
Sure.
in his blood because it's not blood like ours. It was divine blood. And so what we end up doing is we end up separating Jesus from our own humanness and our own human experience. And whether he becomes just like a quasi-human floating above the fray or
Yeah.
someone off to the side, he certainly doesn't become what the Hebrews writer says is so important, which is that he knows our difficulty. He knows our temptations. He knows our failings, our weaknesses. He has borne all of that. And it's because he has been tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. He is a faithful and a merciful high priest on behalf of people. So one of the early church fathers had put it this way, that the unassumed is the unredeemed or the unhealed. And his point was that God, through incarnation, can only heal our humanness to the extent that he touches our humanness. And if we believe, as Christians tend to believe, and they ought to, that every part of our human existence is touched by this thing of the curse and the fall and the desolating and vandalizing, ultimately the destroying of our authentic humanness. If we see every part of us touched by sin in that sense, then God has to touch us at all of those points in order to heal all of those points. So if Jesus really didn't, if the incarnation didn't meet us fully, thoroughly at the point of our actual humanness, then we're not really redeemed. We're not truly healed. And so that's a fundamental principle, that unless the incarnation is God taking up our humanness as it actually is, our broken, estranged, alienated, exiled humanness, as we've been using those terms, then we really can't even talk about a legitimate and true salvation. And, one of the things that we've emphasized even in this issue of incarnation is that most specifically, the scriptures see incarnation as this is Yahweh, the God of Israel. This is the way the prophets speak. This is how Yahweh returns. He takes up Israel's life and lot to heal Israel for the sake of the world. Well, Israel is a part of this Adamic human race, right? They're in the same position as everybody else. They're just as much touched by the curse, by exile, by alienation. That's the whole point, is that Israel could not be the image son, the true human being that they were called to be. And so God takes up that brokenness. God takes up Israel's unfaithful, alienated, exiled state of being through incarnation to bring an Israelite, this servant that we've discussed, out of Israel in order to restore Israel to himself through him. So even when we look at the way the Old Testament talks about this issue of incarnation, we see that we have to understand Jesus as a human being thoroughly, truly, completely as we are, yet without sin. And we'll talk more about how to understand that. But if we start off with this idea that incarnation means he's a different sort of person, he's not like us, he's not a human being like us, then we've really destroyed the whole idea of incarnation biblically, and we've destroyed the idea of incarnation actually serving our healing and our restoration and God's goal to produce a consummately true human family, a new family in a new Adam.
Indeed, indeed. If God is fully disclosed in the incarnate Son, Kit, consider the implication that our understanding of God must begin with Jesus rather than abstract philosophical categories and divine attributes, which we then tend to project onto Jesus. Speak to that a little.
Yeah, and that's and this is maybe in some people's minds, not entirely practical, more theological, more a matter of doctrine or theology, but it is an important point, which is that our natural tendency, we think of Jesus as the God-man. So the way that we want to understand who he is to start with our notions of who God is and then project that onto him. And so when we think about who this being called God is, we tend to say, okay, he's omniscient, he's omnipotent, he's omnipresent, he's holy, he's just, he's merciful, a catalog of attributes. And I'm not saying God isn't those things, but we tend to want to kind of define him in terms of attributes and doctrinal qualities or characteristics. And then we want to project that onto Jesus, because if he's fully God as well as fully man, then he's got to be like that. And then we find ourselves, and I'm sure you've run into this, but it's a very common thing where people struggle with trying to understand the Gospels, the four Gospels, the way they present this person, Jesus of Nazareth, who talks in a way that doesn't seem as if he's omniscient, who talks and acts in a way as if he's fully dependent on the power of the Spirit, fully dependent on the leading of God, the leading of the Spirit, a person who is subject to weakness, obviously a person who's not omnipresent. He's walking around, he's here, and then he's there, and so we have a hard time when we start by saying, okay, if he's God, then he knows everything. If he's God, then he has all insight into all things, and he has all power, and he can do all these things. Well, where's all this stuff then in the Gospels of him being dependent and, being anointed with the Spirit and all of that, all of these? How do we understand this kind of human presentation? And really what we need to do, and this is something that I think is startling, but and not terribly easy to do, but with the incarnation, if we do believe that in this person, Jesus of Nazareth, we see, as Paul said, the fullness of deity dwelling bodily. If we see the full manifest truth of the living God, the one true God, in this human person, Jesus of Nazareth, that means from the point of incarnation, the true and exhaustive, complete knowledge of God is in Jesus, the Messiah. It's in Jesus, the man, such that we don't start with attributes and project them onto Jesus. We have to start with what we see revealed in this person that's shown to us in the Gospels and understand this divine, eternal God in that sort of way. And that's really what, among other things, when Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. In me, you see the truth of who God is. And so you cannot know the living God except as you know him in me and through me. And that means that Jesus is the lens for a right theology, a right understanding of God, not starting with attributes and ideas about a being called God and trying to project them onto the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And that's a very important distinction, and it has lots of practical implications as well that I'm sure our viewers will be already wrestling with in their heads and thinking through.
On a related note, in what way does the incarnation reveal not only God's movement towards humanity, which I think hopefully we've started to clarify a little bit more, but humanity's union with God, in particular around two distinct roles? Jesus being the true sanctuary, and as we've alluded to multiple times, Jesus being the last Adam, right? In terms of his consummate fulfillment of that and all that Adam represented.
Right. Well, I mean, the first thing, again, that incarnation we have to take from it is that it is a crucial step in the process of God accomplishing his eternal designs. And so even thinking about, okay, what are those ultimate designs of God? What are his ultimate purposes? Well, that has to be understood through this lens of incarnation. And in incarnation, we see God forming a comprehensive, perfect, exhaustive union with his human creature. This I in you, you in me idea, right? If incarnation is the living God taking up human existence, it's a forming of a perfect, complete, absolute union between God and man. In a very real way, it's God humanizing himself. And we've talked about how that becomes a huge issue in even understanding immutability. And I thought God doesn't change. Well, if we are Trinitarian, we believe in a Trinity such that the incarnate Son is fully God, then God has taken to himself everlastingly in that incarnate Son our human existence. God is forever humanized. And that speaks very much again to his ultimate intent for his creation. God didn't want to just create a world that he kind of stands back and waves his scepter over and makes things happen and moves chess pieces around on it. God wanted to fill and be immediately present in his creation by, in a sense, taking that creation up to himself. Well, how does he do that? He does that by uniting himself completely, exhaustively with the human creature, so that man in that sense becomes God, God's presence, mind, will, goodness in the world. Man is God unto the world, but he also bears, again, that creation's relationship back to God. So that's kind of the big idea of how incarnation is telling us where God is ultimately going. We see his intent is to have this perfectly intimate communion with his creation that is centered in human beings. But God is entering into a broken creation, a cursed creation. He's taking up broken, alienated, Adamic human existence in order to heal that in himself. And so the first point of this, gathering the creation back to himself, is God healing the human creature in order that now man can fulfill that mediatorial administrative stewarding role. So the incarnation, I think this is probably what you're getting at, is both God unto man, ultimately for the sake of the creation, but it's also man unto God, because God, by taking up our human existence, is intending to heal it and restore it. And so in the person of Jesus, we see God unto his creation through intimate union with the creature man. But we also see man being truly human through Jesus' own life of faithful sonship. And we'll be talking about this more, but his own life of, in a sense, pushing back against and denying, contradicting his own Adamic humanness into which he was born, was him being man indeed back to God. He is agreeing with God concerning who man ought to be. So he's man in truth, but he's also God in truth. And it becomes this thing of pulling both together. And that's the sense, as we've mentioned before, where the prophets, particularly Isaiah, speak of this coming servant, God making him be the embodiment of the covenant for the sake of the world. Well, what was the covenant? The covenant with Israel was the way in which God established and prescribed this relationship of father and son. Israel is my son. Israel was to be intimately connected with God and manifest God in the world for the sake of, again, this Abrahamic vocation of gathering in all the nations. So the covenant is what brought God and man together, if we want to put it that way. So this covenant idea actually is embodied in Jesus, where we see God and man coming together very thoroughly. That then leads into this sanctuary idea, and I think this is something we'll continue to unpack. But so many Christians are just kind of even obsessed, or certainly anticipating this idea of a rebuilt temple. We can't wait till there's a new temple in Jerusalem. Oh, Israel is the Holy Land, whatever. Well, really what Canaan was all about is this was sacred space. That was the place where God had ordained that he would dwell. And he brought the sons of Israel out of Egypt to dwell with him in his sanctuary land. Canaan was holy land because it was the place where God dwelled. But once God left, once he departed, the temple was gone. It's just a piece of real estate on the face of the planet. But again, God's intent has always been to have this oneness, this immediate intimacy with his creation, to fulfill this idea of sacred space, such that the whole creation would become his temple, his dwelling place. We see that temple building project in Genesis 1 and 2. So all of the Old Testament history leading up to the coming of Jesus, as we've discussed, was centered in this theme, or at least had as a central theme, this idea of temple, God being present in the world, specifically in the midst of his covenant people. So God's promise then, after the captivities, the exiles, he leaves, he sends them away. He promises to return and once again dwell in their midst. And what the gospel writers recognize is that the way in which God has returned to dwell in his midst is not to have his Shekinah glory fall again on this temple in Jerusalem and once again have that luminous presence, but God is going to return and dwell in the midst of his people through this thing, incarnation. We've talked about that in John's gospel particularly. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Well, that's temple Shekinah language. And John makes it very clear that Jesus is the fulfillment of the temple idea, because he is that place where God and the creation come together. That's what sacred space, that's what sanctuary, that's what temple's all about. This is the place where you go to encounter God and meet with him. And through incarnation, God now has established if you will, the human creature as sacred space. And this will ultimately lead, as we continue on with this, to how the New Testament writers speak so much in terms of the church as the temple of God, right? The dwelling of God in the Spirit. And so with the incarnation, here's, I guess, part of the point I'm making. With the incarnation, the whole idea of physical temple becomes obsolete in the sense of a building, and the idea of Jerusalem as holy in that sense, or the idea of Canaan, the land of Israel as holy in that sense. No, what made those structures and places holy was that was where God was residing. But now he resides in the world, in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, and in all of those who share in him, in the resurrected Messiah. So the church is the fulfillment, ultimately, in that sense, of the temple idea, but for the sake of ultimately the whole creation becoming sacred space. This is Revelation 21 and 22. So I know there's a lot in that,
Yeah.
but obviously they're very practical things that come out of even our expectation of, a church building as a holy place, or like I said, a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem is a holy place. No. And Jesus said that to the woman at Samaria, right? She said, do we worship here on Mount Gerizim as our Samaritan fathers have taught us, or do we worship in Jerusalem as you Jews say? And Jesus says, an hour is coming and now is, when neither in Jerusalem or on this mountain, because sacred space, the temple, the dwelling place of God, is now incarnate in him. And so God is seeking worshipers in spirit and truth. And once again, that comes out in John's gospel, who's very concerned to show Jesus as the true temple.
Yeah. The shadows have passed away because the substance has come too, And so, Kit, like it really speaks to our last question too, recognizing Jesus as the substance of true humanity, which I think you really put a bow on right there, rather than a mere example, is a critical foundational component of rightly understanding the incarnation. Hopefully, we've solidified that, we've clarified that in people's mind. However, I think it then raises the question, how does that reality, how does that rightly understanding that truth now reshape our understanding and salvation as incorporation into him and participation in God's new creation? And maybe put simply, Kit, too, is how do we guard against this perception that a lot of people have that we are ultimately passive spectators, right? That we, in a sense, are a subject of this creational reality versus being taken up in it and being active, intentional participants too, which is what I think Scripture presents.
Yeah, this is a huge practical issue, and maybe we can introduce it and have to pick it up a little bit in our next episode. But I think that not understanding not just the nature of incarnation, but the function, the purpose, the work of incarnation helps to support this common idea of, again, a God who's out there and we're down here. And this whole thing is him saying, here's the way that you're supposed to live. Oh, you've fallen short. There's a big problem, because unless you're perfect, you can't go to heaven. So you're going to, you've brought this wrath upon yourself. You brought this judgment because you've broken my holy, eternal moral law. And therefore your outcome is hell. And so we basically think in terms of our lives here on the earth, walking along, doing our thing. And at the end, we either fly up into heaven or drop down into hell. And all of that's dependent on, that outcome is dependent on how well we have met God's standard in this life. And I know I'm kind of simplifying and caricaturing, but that's basically the way a lot of Christians think. So salvation becomes the answer to that quandary. It simply is a remedy that God has provided so that we don't have to go to hell, we can go to heaven. But it still very much sees this, God is out there, he's got a standard. Have we met his standard? Have we not? Jesus comes as the guy who meets the standard. And that's how we tend to even think about incarnation again. God just needed a sinless substitute to take our place. But the way that we've been discussing incarnation as the way in which God is working towards, and really incarnation as the essential, substantial fulfillment of that work of God reconciling himself to his creation with human beings at the center. Incarnation really is the beginning and the substance of that healing, ingathering, restoring work. Well, what is that restoring work? It's again that God will be one with his human creature such that his own relationship with his creation will be in and through that human creature. So as you put it, it's not a legal issue of, okay, here's the crime, here's the punishment, which all that's kind of impersonal and at a distance. This is about the need for human beings to find their authentic, genuine human existence as Paul would put it, being taken up in the life of God in Christ by the Spirit. So now we're back to this whole idea again of the church as the dwelling of God in the Spirit. So salvation has to be thought of in that type of a way. It has to be thought of in terms of us being fully restored, and even more than just restored, us being ultimately completed in the design that God has for us as human beings. And Jesus himself said that that design is what you see in me. As I'm in the Father and the Father is in me, so we are in you. And the goal is I in you, you in me. Salvation is about this exhaustive, intimate communion in the Spirit between us and between God. It's not about dealing with infractions. It's about ending the human in the creational exile. And so this becomes a matter of who we are, not have we met a standard, and who we are in the sense of a human definition and a human existence that is defined by Christ himself, that is defined by God himself. And, maybe that's kind of a launching pad into our next episode.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And Kate, just one thing I want to stamp too, we'll pick up with this too as we jump into the second part, is I love when you said too, is that this idea of restoration and redemption is not about dealing with infraction, but it is ultimately about addressing and dealing with this idea of exile and alienation and estrangement. And we've even stamped it a couple episodes ago when it's ultimately a graphic portrayal of God delivering captives, right? Like there is a real
Right.
captivity at place in the spiritual realm. And anything that speaks to anything less than that is actually a compromise of the very message that the scripture upholds and promotes as well too. So we'll put a pin in that for now. Hopefully that's a good teaser for the next time we come back to as we pick up with part two. But we sincerely hope that you've enjoyed the time that you've shared with us and that has been profitable. Once again, don't forget to check out our website and subscribe to our YouTube podcast. I also want to make a quick plug. If you go on our website, there's an amazing redemptive historical glossary, which unpacks a lot of the terms that Kit and I have referenced, in addition to a lot of books at a lot of different levels that really help unpack a lot of these redemptive historical terms. So please take a look at those resources. And we look forward to you joining us for our next episode. For Kit, I'm Farhan, and we'll see you down the road.